Hello and welcome to a brand new podcast aimed at lifting the lid on sport finance and delving a bit deeper into some of the most pressing issues facing the games we love and the games we play. In response to the need for an independent voice in such a noisy environment, Leonard Curtis has launched the Business of Sport series, which aims to provide validated sets of financial data plus professional commentary for major sports all in one place. As part of their multi-channel campaign, we're delighted to welcome you to our first podcast series entitled Sports Structured. Put quite simply, it's all the facts and figures you need to know from the people who know what they're talking about, and backed by Leonard Curtis, who have more than 3 decades of expertise in recovery and turning things around. I'm delighted to say we're recording the podcast right here at the sparkling new broadcasting studio at UCFB's headquarters in Manchester. And we start the ball rolling by posing this question. Is it time for professional sport to grow up? Before we look at that, let me introduce you to two people who certainly got strong opinions on the matter at hand, and 2 gentlemen you're going to get to know a lot better in the coming months. Alongside me, someone who spent a decade running fast and catching rugby balls professionally, and who's now dedicated to stopping businesses dropping the ball with Leonard Curtis. It's Alex Cadwallader. And next to him, someone I love nattering to, a sports business expert who's also Dean of UCFB and a professor too. It's Rob Wilson. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio. Welcome to Sports Structured. As a journalist, I am always asking who, what, why, where, and when. So I want to start with who, what, where, why, and when, and start with who. So quick positive history, Alex Cadwallader, on who you are and why you're here.
Yeah, so I am working backwards. I'm currently a restructuring advisor at Leonard Curtis. And as you've already mentioned, my day job is advising various stakeholders on the challenges and their options when dealing with financially stressed situations. Initially, my dream when I grew up was not to be an insolvency practitioner. It was to be a professional sportsman, and being supported, by my family. I managed to achieve that for a few years playing rugby union for some clubs in England and Wales, and then made a decision at sort of the year, mid-20s, that I wasn't quite going to achieve what I wanted to achieve, and took a decision to step away from the full-time game, and left Newcastle Falcons and started this career while continuing to play semi-professional rugby at London Welsh, where I developed some of my best friends that I still speak to regularly and have all gone on to do different things sort of in the business world. So that's a bit about who. Do you want me to touch on what and why yet?
We'll do what and why in a minute. I want to meet Rob and get Rob introduced, professor and a dean. Importantly, he didn't play elite sport, much like me. So we're in awe of Alex in many, many ways. But tell me a bit more about the journey and the story.
Journey and story. So I'm a professor of applied sport finance, now working at the University Campus of Football Business. I think the key thing there about me is it's applied. So all the way through my academic career, I've tried to inquire, investigate, understand what on earth is going on in the professional sport sector. That means that we can deliver great education to students that's contemporary and is connected. And as that career kind of evolved and I moved up the ladder in career terms in higher education, so too did my external contact book. Meeting people like Alex, like the team at Leonard Curtis, which gives you an opportunity really to practice what you preach, to connect with the people that are doing the hard yards on the ground, and that's what I think really defines me as a person is that knowledge applied, that applied sport finance in my case, and connecting universities with industry experience.
So Alex, Leonard Curtis, well established over 3 decades. I think 30 offices around the country, more than 300 staff.
Yeah.
Why mess around with sport?
Well, I think I'll be honest. It was a bit of a personal interest, and I felt a little bit frustrated that not enough attention was being paid to one of my favourite sports, being rugby union. There had been clubs that unfortunately had gone into administration, and I was sort of aware of the financial state and the losses that were being suffered. And just felt that the model wasn't right, but no one was really highlighting it or weren't able to get the reach that we thankfully were. So we also realised that sport is really ingrained in a lot of people's way of life, and it's actually quite interesting. And the general public and those in the business world actually are quite interested in what's going on in sport, and that's timed quite nicely with the rapid increase of private equity investment into the sport, and it's become more professional. So the desire for me initially, and ably supported by everyone else at Leonard Curtis, was to really do a bit of a deep dive into rugby union, and highlight some of the concerns, some of the challenges, and ultimately last year we put forward some recommendations, which thankfully we have seen some changes come through. So initially that was the remit, that was the desire, and we also wanted to engage with someone like Rob, who's well established in this space, understands how to deliver a certain message, because it's quite different from what we do in our day job, and there's a slight nuance to it. And Rob's been absolutely and his colleagues have been invaluable in us being able to deliver what we've delivered to date.
How important, Rob, was it having a report and investigation and research that probably had teeth and gave you kind of freedom within the space? You're not dealing with stakeholders, you're not dealing with clients. You have the freedom to kind of lift lids and look wherever you need to look.
It's objective. That's, I think, really important. But it's also not a piece of research that's hiding away on a journal shelf somewhere that 5 or 6 people might read, or it is contained within that academic ecosystem. What we're able to do here is really connect applied knowledge, the work that Leonard Curtis are doing, against a backdrop of all the research and the deeper understanding that we can deliver as kind of quasi academics. I forgot my elbow patches today, so I'm sitting in that space of in a higher education institution, but also trying to have an impact in sector, and I think it really amplifies the voice of what we're trying to do. It's hugely credible. People are starting to pay attention. I've lost count of how many times the work, particularly the first report, Alex, that we did, has been cited in big mainstream media. You have top executives talking about it. We are connecting now with chief executives and boards at some major sports organisations, and that brings with it a real richness of data, of understanding, and it allows us then to talk about the messages that I think need to be communicated, but also the big lessons that sport needs to understand, because as the kind of entry to the pod suggests, my view is that professional sport probably needs to grow up a little bit and have a reality check. So
it becomes a passion project, it becomes something more than that with loads more depth. Did you kind of know what you're getting into, bearing in mind we're on the other side of things right now?
I think with rugby I knew what the answer was, and it was about trying to highlight some of the concerns there. And then we felt the response that we'd had, that people were respecting our voice, were listening to us, we were getting traction. Then it was about looking at what other sports could potentially be open to us, taking a view and giving a view that people are prepared to listen to. And as I said, also, this does coincide with, just a change in the general dynamic. I suspect you go back 10 years ago and ask a 15-year-old about PSR at West Ham, they won't have a clue. But I suspect a lot of them do now, and it is in the press. You turn on a news channel, where you used to work, and you do get updates on how close a club is to PSR. So, the climate has changed, and the business models behind these sports, which ultimately you always have to remember, sport isn't just a business; it's an integral part of society, and can make so much change for good. And it's not all about the P&L and the balance sheet, but as soon as you start bringing in external investment, that's going to be their focus. And it does have knock-on effects if we don't have a good structure and good governance in place and some sensible planning. So, yeah, I think we felt this was always a space that attracted some interest. And we've seen, some of our competitors, not to say competitors, large professional services firms own top-end football, and they produce an annual report. And we're looking to do the same, but against a wider myriad of sports. Yeah, it's more than just football, it's sport. And the credibility that comes with reports like this, Rob, means that other sports probably are scared of you knocking on their door, but also maybe think it's a useful exercise as well. Yeah, look, we're all sports fans, aren't we? Whatever your poison, whether it's Premier League football, whether it's non-league football, whether it's rugby league, union. I have a particular interest at the moment in Netball Super League because my daughter plays. And understanding the decisions that are being made in all of those sports, the rationale behind some of the investment we're seeing, the regulations and the governance positions that we are starting to visit, all needs a bit of education. And that includes for those boards, because sometimes a new regulation will be put in place and
I imagine as a board member, you would sometimes fear that from happening. So how on earth are we going to gain our competitive advantage now? We can't just drop £10 million on player wages or £100 million on a player transfer, or, spend 50 million quid designing a new engine in an F1 car. All of those decisions need to be calculated. They need to be understood against this backdrop of competitive integrity. We need to understand that our competition is as important as we are, because without them, we are nothing. So I don't know if those boards fear the knock on the door. Actually, what we've noticed through these reports is that they're starting to come to us and ask, really discerning questions. What do you think about this? How do you think we might compete against these people or these other teams? The cricket report that we did most recently really shone a spotlight on the non-100 non-100 clubs and the smaller first-class cricket counties didn't host Test cricket. First time they've ever seen that report in a single place, so that they can see how they're actually performing against their competitor groups. And ultimately, I think what we're really trying to get out of this is a more sensible planning process that builds a more sustainable professional sport ecosystem that enables us to enjoy sport much more when we are inevitably stood on a terrace or sat in a corporate box or something like that.
So before we jump into the data and the research, I just want to ask you one primary question. And it's about the business of sport, which is what we're talking about. Is sport a business, or is it just not a better word for it? Bearing in mind, you're now a businessman, you know how successful businesses run. And then you're looking at some of these other sports, calling themselves businesses and not running themselves in the same way. Is it just not a better word for what it is? Or are they hiding behind sport being a business?
No, I think sports entertainment is a business, and I think we have to accept that when it generates the commercial revenue that it does, then you have to apply some of the sensible business rationale that you would to a normal business. The real uniqueness is the fans, the culture, how it's interwoven within society or not in certain circumstances, and it's taking all those things into account. But there's no way you could look at Mercedes Formula One team and not think that is a business. Now, if you want to compare that to, I'll probably get the name wrong, apologies, Loughborough Lightning's netball team, you are basically trying to compare, JP Morgan with the local fish and chips shop. So they're very different businesses, but it is still a business and they have responsibilities. And where it is different is they don't necessarily, and whilst, from a governance point of view, it is the case, we expect our sports clubs and teams to have a greater responsibility than just to their shareholders. You're looking after something that can deliver significant change, improve lots of people's lives, including participation at grassroots, the players that are there, the medical staff, so on and so on, and the supporters. So it's a lot to take on as a business, an owner of a sports business, where it's different from running JP Morgan, when in reality they want their shareholders to get the best return possible.
There are moments as a host when you realise you've given someone a bag of sick to deal with. And I apologise for that.
That's right.
I bet a fairer question probably would have been, and I'll ask this, Rob, is sport perhaps becoming a business? Is that maybe a better way of looking at it?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Alex. As soon as you've got something that resembles a transaction, you sell a ticket for entry to a game or to a cinema or wherever that might be, you effectively have a business transaction taking place. And all of those organisations, whatever their size, have to adhere to the first principles of finance, I think. So the first thing I would always teach in a finance class is the selling price higher than the cost. Can you pay your debts as they fall due? If you can't do those things, you can't effectively run an organisation. And then when we look at professional sport as a broader ecosystem, that cultural capital that Alex discussed and mentioned, you can start to see how much impact that has in a much broader community. So, gone are the days of what we might call a traditional fan or a local fan. Manchester United have got local fans that are spread all over the four quarters of the globe. Loughborough Lightning or Nottingham Forest Netball, where Sophie plays, have a much smaller catchment area, but the principles are exactly the same. If they can't afford to pay their players or to pay the running costs of the organisation, they run into trouble. As fans, we don't want to be paying it all ourselves, because the ticket prices would just keep going up and up and up as competition improves. And that's meant this swathe of external capital coming into the game, whether it's through owners or whether it's through private equity funds or other family offices, and all of that needs the same sort of treatment.
I think, James, just to maybe put a slight tweak on your question, I think stringent business models are required more now than they were historically. When we first started, supporting teams, it'd almost be the local businessman who does really well can take their team up to the top league, and it was a passion project. Whereas now, that's a pretty dangerous slope to go down, and we've seen, if you look at, football clubs that have got very close to the Premier League and then not made it, and then you see how much that family that owned that business has lost. That model just doesn't work anymore. And so I think, the models behind the clubs now have to be a lot more focused on the businesses, the fundamental structures, and have a proper business plan. Whereas going back a few years, it was a bit, you saw a lot more, investors, also local businessmen wanting to take their local club. Look at, the Blackburns of going back to the football, which a lot of our viewers will be aware of. I think that's a lot less likely to happen now.
I want to talk through the reports, starting with rugby union, then go into cricket and kind of talk about the lessons that are learned there. The first question I want to ask you was on a scale of 10, where 0 is dying man, 10 is superhuman. Where's rugby union at right now?
Rugby union is still hopefully searching for a formula that works. It's in a much better place now than it was probably 2 or 3 years ago. The move to a closed shop for a period of time, whether we call it a franchise model or not, I think is sensible. I often say, and you mentioned, we want to give the figures. I often say, if you look at rugby union, the club game in England, it's a business that turns over £200 million on average a year. Historically, the clubs that combined would spend about 230. So where I think they should get to is maybe for 1 year, just spend 180 or aim to do that. Have a stable platform, give some certainty to the clubs that they will be there for the next 2-3 years, allow investors to see that there's some stability. They're not going to have to write out checks approaching £10 million a year. And you can grow from that. And then if you look at the profile of the investors that are coming in now, compared to, when Worcester Warriors were, open for new investment, it's chalk and cheese. I don't think Prem Rugby could have picked better profile of investors that are showing interest. We've still got a long way to go, because I know Exeter are announcing they've just done a deal with the group that own AFC Bournemouth. But I doubt it's going to deliver a massive return for the incumbent owner. I suspect, last set of accounts, they lost £10 million. So it's not as if they've turned the corner and these clubs are trading at values that football clubs are. So they've got an opportunity. It's a decent platform to grow from, but we're certainly not at 10 yet.
Yeah, give me a number.
I would say, I think we're at 5, and they've got the opportunity to try and get it to 6. But the game is sort of floated around 3 to 5 for the last, 25 years, I would say, James.
Rob, you're nodding at 5. Is 5 about right? Or
yeah, I was thinking about 6, but I'm the eternal optimist. What Alex is kind of pointing to is we've seen a shift in the types of people that have been investing in professional sport. So gone, really, I think, are the days where that local business person that was doing really well bought their local team for £1 because their mate had essentially spent all of their cash and it had fallen on hard times. And we saw that kind of going through the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the early 90s, where that was the typical reaction. Then you got some bigger investors, normally private individuals that had a lot more wealth. What we're now seeing are businesses acquiring these teams. So there is a natural kind of maturity of these markets. And I agree with Alex, the investment that we're starting to see in rugby union seems a lot more mature, a lot more discernible. They're making some really smart decisions, and they're moving away from that older school model. And of course they've got to, because as the value of money goes up over time, so too do the valuations of those teams, and they become less affordable for many, many more people, which is why if you look at a Premier League football team, there are very few people or indeed organisations that can afford to make that acquisition. Rugby union actually is quite a cheap asset to buy.
Exactly, and I think that's something we've got to be aware of. Whilst it's great, these slightly larger entities that have multi-clubs are putting their investment in, how much are they actually putting in? How far up their priority list is this investment to be? Because if I asked you how many other clubs the guys that are coming into Exeter owned, you'd be quite surprised. AFC Bournemouth are the big ones, but there are lots of others behind. So is it just going to be, well, actually, we think Exeter's a relatively low value. Other people have put some money into the league. Let's just take a bit of a punt and see what happens. Or are they going to come in there, invest, try and really work with the other owners and the league to drive the whole league forward?
What's the difference, though, in investment when you're looking at 2019 and a big dollop of private equity money, £200 million, just got eaten up like that, didn't it?
It did. And I think if the private equity firm had that opportunity again, I think they would have put some different sort of terms and conditions on their investment, in that if certain KPIs, if certain targets weren't achieved, they would have had greater control to make some changes, because ultimately they took sort of minority stakes in lots of different entities within rugby globally, not just in England, but they didn't actually have control, which we've always been saying. And one of my initial points was, how do I apply my day job to what's going on in rugby? And I said, well, the first thing you do is get all the data, understand the financial position, which we've done, and then you say, right, I need the management team, I need the directors to sit down in a room and work that through. In English rugby union, the club game, who is that? And that was the first challenge. How can I actually make this change? First of all, I don't even know who I need in that room, and they've all got different agendas.
And have you found out since, or is it a big number?
I think that's the problem. Is it's the governance.
Yeah.
Because the RFU, Prem Rugby, the owners themselves all have a control of different entities. Whereas, obviously, we're going slightly deep into rugby. Whereas the WRU do actually have that control. But unfortunately, what they put forward, which I supported earlier this year and last year in terms of the restructure, has now ultimately been rejected due to political pressure, local MPs, local councillors saying, no, this isn't acceptable. We want to go back to four teams, when they know that the current structure they have does not produce high quality teams, is loss making, and has a knock-on effect on the national team. So they already know that model doesn't work, and they have the ability to make the change much easier than we do in England, and they still haven't been able to do it.
How hard then is it waving that flag that says for the good of the game and nobody appreciating that? Because you're obviously passionate.
Yeah, it is difficult, and rugby is a massive sport in Wales. It is their football, and even more so. So for them, it's all about getting the communications right, getting us buy-in as much as possible. And it's a challenge. It's not easy. It's similar to when I think David Cameron mentioned one time in Parliament, well, the Portsmouth fans can just go and support Southampton. And it was an absolute uproar. And almost that's been implied. That's what should happen with, teams in West Wales, the Ospreys fans supporting the Scarlets. Well, no, they're our biggest rivals. How can you think that's a sensible argument? But, Rob and I look at it from having an understanding of that passion, but also from, what you're trying to achieve. What do fans in Wales want? Do they want a successful Wales team, and do they want their regional clubs to compete? I think the answer to that is yes. And you just have to accept the grim realities of the Ospreys as a club, as a business. You can't compare it to Bordeaux and La Rochelle. They are 5 times, if not 6 times bigger, and you're trying to compete. So unless you make some changes, it's just not going to work.
I've got to say, in my podcast bingo, I never thought we'd get David Cameron, so I'm delighted about that. That's a rare card. And you mentioned the French game, and again, we're deviating a little bit away from the report, and I apologise for that. But why are they getting things so right and we're getting things so wrong? Because their league is incredible. Everyone wants to play there. I mean, I know money's involved as well, clearly, but they have an entertaining brand, and they have a national team that clearly is better than our national team at the moment.
Well, I think ultimately it's almost just based on what they naturally have there, James. So they don't have the Premier League to compete. The clubs that you probably argue struggle the most in France are the ones based in Paris, because they do have Paris Saint-Germain. But rugby is part of their culture. You are a dad on a Saturday morning in Bordeaux. You're not sure what you're going to do. Rugby is front and centre. Everyone goes on a Saturday morning into the centre of Bordeaux and then walks a mile to go and watch a game. It's part of their DNA, whereas we don't really have that here. We also have rugby league and rugby union. The French don't. And as Rob will attest, pretty much every metric, when you compare the English game to the French game, theirs is 3 times bigger. They have 3 times more participants. The viewing figures are 3 times higher. So therefore you have ultimately, as we've said, money talks, but it's embedded in their way of life. If you wanted to go and buy, for instance, if you want to go and buy Brive, who are in Division 2, the local council have to onboard you and be happy that you're going to be investing in the community and so on and so on. And that's, so I think one of our challenges in England and in the UK is that we always feel that actually we're the ones that started these sports. It's the home of rugby and we need to be at the very top. And we've seen it a little bit in cricket. You know, the resistance we had when the IPL started off in India, none of our players could play. How dare you? You're not going to play for England. You're going to be ostracised. When ultimately, you know, I suspect a lot more people play cricket in India than they do in England. And you've got the same with rugby in France. So I think we want to stop trying to compete with them, try and learn some things from them, but just accept, you know, they are able to generate more eyeballs watching the game and it is more part of their game. You know, sorry, more part of their society is watching rugby than it is in England.
There's part of me that spent half a minute just thinking about being a dad in Bordeaux.
Yeah.
You know, you painted that picture beautifully and I'm wondering why I'm a dad in Cheadle Hulme. But Rob, when you looked under the bonnet of rugby union, you were probably thinking that with some trepidation, this is going to be bad. Was it worse than you thought or was it about...
It was. I mean, we've been looking at financial reports for rugby union clubs for a long time, but hadn't really put them all together in one collective place. And the headlines were stark coming out of the report. You know, the number of clubs that were technically insolvent on their balance sheets. You know, Alex and I both have friends that are now working in and around the kind of administration of the game, and you're thinking that's their club. Their club is losing 6, 7, 8, 10 million. Where's the next wave of revenue coming from? And the whole thing, to be perfectly honest, was in disarray. You mentioned the private equity that came into the sport a few years ago. That all just got frittered away on player wages. The salary cap was probably too high because we were scared about what was going on in France and all those kind of discussions around English players playing in France would not be available for the national team and so on and so forth. The whole thing was just a bit of a checkered mess. And I think what the report has really helped us do is just put everything in one place, start to really unpick what's actually going on and start then to inform those decisions that probably need to be made to ultimately strengthen the sustainability of that sport.
And interesting, within that, there was a performance index which kind of monitored growth on the pitch and off the pitch.
Yeah, and that's the kind of academic thing. You know, we've been playing around with that model for 10 or 15 years, ever since Dr. Dan Plumley, my sidekick, as you well know.
Yeah, if he's watching.
His PhD sort of built this model for holistic performance and for the first time really puts together those ideas that you have to be competitive on the field, or rather question, are you competitive on the field, versus what's happening off it. And we've always had this conundrum, you know, which one drives the other? Is it sporting performance that drives your financial performance, or is it the financial performance that drives sporting performance? And the honest answer as a prof is, I still don't really know. What we do know is that the two are linked. So the more successful you are on the field, the more likely you are to be successful of it. We will always get some outliers. But what we find in professional sport is a big collection of teams that are in the bottom left quadrant, which is they're not particularly good on the field and they're certainly not particularly good off it in terms of their financial health. So that gives them performance indicators, markers to make better decisions and then hopefully kind of move themselves into the top right quadrant.
Slightly related to this, but not at all related to this, but having been a player and been out for what a player's out for, and it's no different from anybody else looking to get the best price. And I think sometimes players are unfairly criticised for doing what everyone else does in any industry. But are you now in the camp that you can't be paying players that if it's not?
Yeah, listen, I think players should look to get paid as much as they can. It's a very short career. There is, in certain sports, there are, you know, long-term implications for, you know, health matters that can arise at a later date. And that includes sort of mental health as well. And, you know, it's not particularly easy. You know, I've been in a changing room in the middle of a restructure with 16 months left on a contract, and the governance, the regulators decided no, the league's changing and your contract is ultimately null and void. I was very fortunate that my owner, came to us and said, go and try and find another contract and I'll top up the shortfall. Other owners just said, well, as per the law, I owe you 1 week's wages, off you go. So it is stressful. But it's not just the players. I think it's just the general spending. And that's the bit that actually surprised me. I thought when you actually looked at, wages, it would be quite close to the salary cap. But actually, there's a lot of other spending that is going on. And a lot of it, we felt, when we put forward the franchise model, could be saved if that was sort of done centrally. And so marketing teams, finance teams actually work together.
It just makes sense, though, doesn't it?
It does. And, one of the things, our CEO, Dan Booth at Leonard Curtis always says at start of often meetings with directors, what does good look like? Start from there, and then how do we understand where you are at the moment? What does good look like? How do we get there? And James, that's the challenge. The guys that are invested and own these clubs are very successful businessmen, are very astute, understand how to run a good business. But in this type of environment, and some of it is their competitive nature. You get two very successful businessmen in a room, and one of them says, no, I want to spend as much as possible next year. I want my club to be European champions. Let's get rid of the salary cap. The other chap's probably just as successful, but for whatever reason doesn't want to do that. Very rarely is he going to put his hand up, or she, and say, I can't afford that. That doesn't work for me. Yeah, there's the owner at Gloucester. Fantastic. He's very open. And it's no ego. He just says, no, I will at maximum lose £500,000 a year. It's a very grown-up approach, but it's very rare. You put two successful business people with egos, they're not going to say, I can't afford that. I know you can.
And there's the paradox, by the way. Gloucester are my team, and they've been awful on the field this year. And it's largely due to the spending on player wages, because the ownership is not prepared to lose much more than £500,000. But as an academic, as a co-author of this report, absolutely what they should be doing. It's just not a shared objective yet across the league. And I think, again, going back, that's why sport really needs to grow up and understand that you have to have your competition to exist. And actually, if you are delivering competitive sport, whatever that competitive sport may be, you all benefit from that.
Yeah.
Look at the way the US system works. Forget the promotion relegation thing, because I almost think it's a red herring at times. But those owners will work with each other within a salary cap, with a commissioner. They will share some levels of sponsorship. And what happens? You get a different winner each year in most of their competitions, and you just watch those franchise values go up and up and up. So nobody's losing the money.
But there's a counter argument. This is when you're part of the chosen few, as Ipswich Town are now. I'm delighted, thanks to the last week. I'm happy with whatever rules and closed shop happen. When you're not in the closed shop, though, it's a very different place to be, though, isn't it?
It's very, very difficult. And that's because of the way the rules have been set up. So Ipswich will have the £120 million windfall for getting promoted to the league.
And they spend it a bit better this time.
And there's a big decision. Because Wolves didn't spend it this year. They've got one of the youngest playing squads in the entire division. They finished second from bottom, I think, maybe even bottom. So as a fan, you're looking at that thinking, well, it's sustainable. We're doing the right thing. The advice we get given is bring your academy players through, use your young players, increase their valuations, and they will probably sell a few players this year for some top money. But they drop back into the Championship. With their parachute payment, they're much bigger than everybody else that should get re-promoted. So Ipswich will be facing exactly the questions that we've been asking through Rugby Union, Rugby League right now. And how do they compete with those big 6, 8, 10 teams, whatever we want to say? The issue of the distribution is where it gets messy in football. So we're enabling those big clubs, in inverted commas, to become bigger through sheer weight and volume of the money that they're being provided.
And it's never one size fits all. Having spoken to a couple of agents of some US sports stars, we don't quite appreciate the real nuances between their top leagues. Some of them do have cost control measures, some don't. And actually, when you try and unlock the history as how they got there, it'll be players going on strike, it'll be bargaining powers, so on and so on. So they haven't just got this perfect model that every sport follows. And football is very different to rugby. One of rugby's issues, I still remember, I think in my opening forward in 1997, Newcastle, I don't think they're the Falcons then, but they went out and bought Inga Twigamala for £1 million. So John Hall owned the football club and the rugby club. And I remember being a youngster thinking, fantastic, the sport I love is now going to, start paying the players exponentially better. This is, great. This is really what I want to do. I don't think there's been £1 million signing since then. So, rugby and football are very different. So just because we put forward some recommendations for a clothes shop in rugby, I don't necessarily think you need it in football. There are different ways of what you want to do is avoiding the Sheffield Wednesdays, the derbies, as best as you can. It's sometimes regulators, I think, get too much criticism. And also my query often, who is the regulator? And is the regulator basically just controlled by the owners already? Whereas, clearly there's been a real push for this independent football regulator. But again, I'm not too sure exactly what control and what real change they can really make.
I want to steer back to data and to research and to the cricket report and link it up with rugby union. It seems to me that, and based on what James Haskell said in the most recent report, that franchise rugby is the way forward. That's the most sensible choice. Is cricket then a panacea of how franchise cricket or franchise sport can succeed, or are there lessons to be learned there as well?
I don't think there are lessons to be learned from how successful the IPL have been. But the same way that I've said we shouldn't get obsessed with what's going on in NFL, or rugby shouldn't just look at the Premier League and say do the same. The numbers there are totally different from what we are trying to achieve. So the 100 money has come in, and I stripped it back to say, okay, if I was advising a business that has been trading very consistently for the last 30 years, and suddenly £500 million was thrown at a third of the clubs in that, how are you going to deal with that? Where does that money go? Those investors probably want their money back. What happens if you don't deliver the returns? You're trying to create a new product in a 1 month window where players are getting pulled absolutely everywhere. How many eyeballs do we actually have in the UK? And is there this massive desire to go and watch some 100 cricket in August when you've got everything else in the world that you could also watch? We often get to, Drive to Survive for Formula One, obviously made a big impact. But there's only one Thursday to watch something on Netflix a week. So the challenge there, James, is like, what's this money going to be used for? And, is the 100 actually going to be a success? So and a sign of success is that those franchises are going to be worth what these people have put money in.
But that's the rub, isn't it? We're talking about a year after the investment's been made, and some counties are doing great because they've got Test cricket and they're part of the 100 club. And then you look at Sussex being put in special measures.
So there's the haves and the have-nots right there. So you've got your test match venues, you've got the 100 franchises, you've got the teams that are going to benefit from all of that additional revenue that is naturally now going to flow through the system somehow. I think the ECB are being really quite smart with how they're releasing some of those funds actually. And, there should be not necessarily a suppression, but certainly a controlling of wages. So we shouldn't see what we saw in rugby union, for instance, where all the money just washed straight back out. Because you have a two-tier system in cricket, you will if we allowed those players to get paid a lot more money because of that 100 windfall, it would really destabilise the have-nots, and Sussex is a really good example. A little teaser for our next cricket report. We've been doing some work on the digital footprint of each of those clubs. And just to put it into context, Jasprit Brumrah can post once on Instagram, and that will get more interactions than Sussex will get across the entire county season. So there are huge differences in both the clubs that are existing within that, or the counties rather, that are existing in that ecosystem, and those that are really competing at the top end. A huge amount of disruption through 100 franchises versus the IPL versus the Big Bash, and I can really see that having a global competition format. That will destabilise clubs a bit more, and that's before we weigh in the importance of counties in terms of their England player pathways and that type of thing.
So the words Rob mentioned, destabilise, disruption. And this all assumes that this investment's going to be successful. So let's assume the 100 is a fantastic success. We've caused all this destabilisation, disruption for the other counties. But with my other hat on, what happens when it also isn't a success? What are we left with? And, I know we're in one of our other podcasts and our reports, we're going to be talking about golf. That's what we're facing now. It's not uncommon to sport. You will often get a disruptor who's putting money in, hopefully, to allow the other competitors to compete. They've got a better financial model, or they've got a better route to market that allows you to change your model to compete. The real challenge is when the money comes in for other purposes, you then scrambling around trying to protect what you have basically destabilising your own proven model to try and compete, the disruptor then disappears, and then you're left with just a bit of a mess. You're overpaying players, you're, ultimately just spending more money than you are generating. And, what's the impact of that? So my real concern is what happens if the 100's not a success and you've caused all of this disruption for what?
But is it also survival of the fattest?
Yeah, but then we always come back to when's the bubble about to burst. And I think every time we inflate the bubble with the extra cash, we are risking that bubble bursting again.
But I mean, there's interesting things. I mean, you talk about what good looks like being a mantra, and it's quite right. Surrey is what good looks like. And in some ways, Lancashire is what good looks like, because they're milking Old Trafford in the same way that Kia Oval's being milked. And yet Lancashire find themselves in the second division of the county championship.
Yeah, but part of that's the beauty of sport, isn't it? Because going back to the index, not all the time do we see financially really successful clubs doing the best on the field. So you might argue that's going on with Chelsea Football Club at the moment. So it's not a binary thing. If you do well financially, you will do well in a sporting context, or vice versa. But what we look at is the structure of those organisations. What are the key hallmarks that they have that can enable them to be more sustainable and more competitive? So let's look at cricket. If you own your own ground, you are likely to do quite well. If you utilise that ground for conferencing, for food and beverage and other external events, concerts and things, you're probably going to do quite well. If you have a test match that's happening at your county, you are probably going to do quite well. There's a challenge for all of those that don't have those things. So we spent some time at Middlesex recently. They don't own Lords. They can't leverage Lords. The MCC will generate all of the revenue from that. So that leaves Middlesex as quite a small county in that context. So then you have to look at the structure of all the counties. So should they be member-owned organisations? Should they be privately owned organisations? Do they need to demutualise? And so on and so on. And that's where, as an academic, it makes sport so much more fascinating than just seeing who puts the ball in the back of the net, who dabs the ball down on a try line, or who hits a six.
And then, as I say, you've got nuances in every sport, because one of the key reasons counties exist is to provide players for England.
Yeah.
That isn't in the the mem and arts of Arsenal FC. That's just a byproduct, and so on and so on. So the other thing I just want to stress, James, is that these are, whilst we're highlighting the challenge, it's still a fantastic opportunity. And hopefully, with making some sensible decisions, the sports can benefit from it. But it does bring challenges to it.
My job is to ask the tricky questions and poke and prod.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do that right now. Who is the greater, better equipped custodian of the game? The RFU or the ECB? Based on research, I'm going to take it away from and make it dispassionate rather than passionate initially.
What a question. I think if we look at the present situation, so right now, I think the ECB are making some really good decisions about how that 100 money is going to be distributed. As Alex said, there will be challenges, but there are loads of opportunities with that. The numbers are smaller for the most part. The ECB are providing, their club grants, which enable the England player performance pathway. I think all of that stuff says to me the structure is a bit stronger.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for the RFU, and I'm probably a bigger rugby fan than I am cricket, if I'm entirely honest, there's been so much disarray across the union. Bill was challenged by, I think, votes of no confidence, wasn't he, last year?
Yeah.
But when you speak to him, a very passionate, discerning guy that wants the best for English Rugby Union and the club setup within that. But because of the way the stakeholder mapping works, Prem Rugby, and then the owners of the clubs and how that governance works, it just makes it a bit more difficult. So you're pushing me, James, and I'm going to say the ECB marginally.
Yeah, and I'd look at, two recent events. Both the RFU and the WRU, in effect, decided that they're going to get some independent views on, restructuring their own governance within the WRU and the RFU, and both then got put to members and were rejected. So, going back to my question, who is in that room? How much control do the RFU actually even have on the club game? They don't have a great deal. There's meant to be sort of alignment, but when it comes to it, are they actually able to work together as well as similar in a way that the ECB are? So they both have those challenges.
The other argument from a financial perspective is it takes longer to chew through 500 million than it does 200 million, and maybe that gives them more time to do that.
Yeah, and again, it's all about the numbers in the game. So if you compare apples with oranges. A first-class cricket county is typically smaller in financial terms than the Premiership Rugby Union club is. So it will take them longer to chew through that 520 million. But again, you speak to some of the chief execs. Stuart Kane at Warwickshire is doing just an unbelievable job of extending that club into the community. Of course they're big, of course they've got Edgbaston, and of course they've got 100 franchise, but they're talking about long-term decisions, regenerating the ground, building things that will have asset value that will then ultimately provide long-term financial sustainability for the county. And that's the stuff you want to hear.
Does it make a difference that there's a relationship between the two divisions as well in cricket and there isn't that relationship in rugby union, or is that being fostered? Because you want a situation where there is some health in that second tier.
You do, but
you've played in it.
No, absolutely, and I had some fantastic times, and it was semi-professional, and most of the clubs in the Champ, as it's been rebranded, are still semi-professional. But the gap is absolutely massive between. And whilst we are supportive of Ealing and Penzance and other teams that perform on the pitch being promoted, it's pretty stark. I think Steve Diamond came out quite bluntly and said, look,
he does.
If you want to compete, you need to try and put a squad together at very short notice after you've been promoted in, say, June. All the good players will have signed new contracts in December. So you'd be left with the likes of me to try and, overpay to get someone like me to join. And you are, invariably, it's same, especially with rugby, just, money does talk in terms of the amount you spend on your squads. And it's going to cost you probably for that 3-year period, 20 to 30 million pounds worth of losses just to try and compete. You're unlikely to, don't have the same infrastructure. You won't have the same people turning up every week. So it's a real challenge. It's a massive leap. So that's where the Div 1, Div 2 situation in cricket is much stronger.
I want you just to finally sort of do some crystal ball gazing.
Yeah.
Certainly in terms of rugby union. In 5 years' time, and you mentioned Newcastle in 97, and you're right, I think everyone was excited by that. In 5 years' time, are we going to see the Newcastle Red Bulls and we're going to see the Cornish Pirates as franchises? Is that what we're going towards?
I hope so. It's still a challenge. I think, the one bit that really disappointed me from the report that we produced is that the clubs not in the traditional rugby heartlands are still struggling. So Newcastle and Sale probably have had England's 2 best ever players playing for them, Johnny Wilkinson, Jason Robinson. And their attendance figures now, I appreciate those players aren't playing anymore, but they've won the leagues, they've competed in Europe, are still really poor. The revenue is still low. And if I asked Rob or yourself to name one of Newcastle Red Bull's signings for next year, could you?
Even with the research that I've done, no.
No. So they still, I'm still unsure exactly what Red Bull are doing. And I'd say exactly the same for Cornish Pirates or Penzance or whatever they'll be branded. Potentially, I would, as I say, going back to a little thing that Rob pointed, you always have slight nuances. So Bath, generally, however they perform, the same people go and watch on a Friday because it's part of their culture. And it goes back to what Bath have is similar, and Northampton and Leicester to a certain extent, it's similar to what you have in Brive, La Rochelle and Perpignan. It's part of your culture to go and play. And if the superstar isn't there or they're not winning the league, you're still going to take your kids there on a Saturday morning. So there are some nuances. What we do know, and the real disappointing thing is, in 25 years, we still haven't found a model that works in non-rugby heartlands in England.
But on the other side of things, it feels like there's a bit of a chase at the moment. You get James Dyson investing in Bristol. You get in Bath. You get the Newcastle with the Red Bulls. You get Bournemouth looking at Exeter.
Yeah.
It does feel as though there's I take your point as well. The sums are smaller, so the risk is less, maybe.
Yeah, the sums are smaller. I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier. They're cheaper to acquire as assets, and I think asking us to crystal ball gaze, I think in 5 years' time that franchised rugby union prem will be a lot stronger than it is now. I think the onus and the ownerships that are going into those clubs will be looking to run those clubs in a more financially sustainable manner. It might mean we have a dip in the salary cap at some point before we recover that. But I think rugby has, in quite a mature way, listened to what was going on and has decided within itself that we can't keep doing this because we've lost 3 of our big clubs, historic clubs in the case of, teams like London Irish and Wasps. We've had experiments. We saw Wasps move from North London across to Coventry and it was just a catastrophic failure, but probably not because the idea was necessarily bad, but the execution just didn't work out and there was too much politics involved. So I think 5 years' time, much more sustainable Prem, with some clubs that are performing well. I do worry in the same way that Alex said, Newcastle and Sale just away from what you might deem a typical rugby union heartland, and it's always going to be difficult. Goodness me, how many professional teams around the corner from Sale that are competing for those same fans and similar up in Newcastle in the northeast? So they need to differentiate somehow. I think we'll see an emergence of multi-sport groups. So you've got different clubs in different sports. And, I'm going to wave the flag for netball quickly because you look at the way Nottingham Forest Football Club and Nottingham Forest Netball are starting to coordinate what they're doing. It's strengthening the brands of both those sports. And I think that's where we'll start seeing Prem Rugby going.
But it does need coordination. It needs understanding.
And they've shown that they have listened and are considering, long term, and they're in a much better position now than they were when we did our first show. Yeah. So I want to be positive.
No, and I want to throw 2 questions at you before we finish. The first of those are a purely rugby union on the pitch situation, 18 months out from a World Cup. If I talked to you in October when we'd just beaten the All Blacks, you might have been talking about a World Cup, and suddenly we're talking you in a situation where we've lost to Italy for the first time. What England is going to show up in Australia in 18 months' time?
Yeah, I think...
hopefully not the one I watched against Ireland.
Oh, God, or France, or Italy.
I think if you look at that 12 run unbeaten, the 12 unbeaten run, a lot of them were, Finn Russell missing a last-minute kick, some very tired Australians and Kiwis. So there's always a balance. I think we have an opportunity to, get to a semi-final. I think it's still a big step as to, whether we can take on, a French team, the All Blacks, and the guys to beat South Africa at the moment. So I think we are, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be celebrating a World Cup win.
But we're being positive, of course. Things could change.
Absolutely. And, I see the RFU have backed Steve Borthwick. So, as a former university colleague back in my Bath University days, I hope he's successful.
That's the other thing, by the way. Some of the research we've done previously talks about managerial change, and you are very often better sticking with the person than changing. So they've made a big call sticking behind Steve this early. I think the autumn will be quite interesting to see if they stick.
I want to round off with a very broad question. We've done really well to tiptoe around football because I think there's loads of noise where there is football. Is it important for other sports like rugby union, like netball, like cricket, to look at what football's done but not be preoccupied by it? In the same way that I always think that Manchester City benefited from never being... They were obsessed by Manchester United and they stopped being obsessed by Manchester United and went their own way. I know money helped with that, clearly.
No comment.
And I don't want to go down those areas either. Yeah. But other sports got to paddle their own boat rather than think, there's the golden cat.
Alex made the point earlier. We shouldn't be comparing sports with sports because rugby union is completely different to football, and actually those narratives are quite damaging. So, why can a player earn £300,000 a week? Well, because the sport thinks it can afford to pay that. You absolutely can't do that in this sport. I have the same challenge. I think I might have spoken to you in the past, James. Same challenges around women's football. Chasing this kind of equity in pay when you've got a sport that is generating a couple of £1 million a year versus a sport that's generating £700 million a year. They are completely different in their ecosystem. So let's stop comparing them. And I think that's probably the big lesson. And we have to look at where organisations fail. I live in Sheffield. Sheffield Wednesday have been through a torrid time since last summer. That is an example of how something can go so catastrophically wrong when bad decisions are made. And it might be a professional football club that was losing. I think they ended up, the owner was in the hole for about £170 million. HMRC have managed to get their money out. He might get 25 million back of that 170 odd, but they've been in administration. They are now going to recover. And I think sport should look at that as a case study. Forget that it's football. Look at the case study. What decisions did that organisation make? Where did they go wrong? What was the outcome of going wrong? And in that instance, it was almost insolvency before they've been rescued. And that's the lesson that all sports need to learn and try and make sure they make decisions to avoid it.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't just look at football, and I think we'll do the same in rugby. And I think a lot of sports, a lot of the investors have looked at the success CVC had with Formula One. So they bought it off Bernie for whatever, let's just say $1 billion, and they had 18 races. I thought, actually, why don't we have some more races? Let's go to 25. And then 5 years later, they sell it to Liberty Media for 16 billion. I'm not sure those exact numbers, but about that. So now we're seeing in all the sports the demands on the players, and we're almost using the same model. Let's keep rolling out more and more of the same product, more matches, more games, more eyeballs, more revenue. But actually, at some point, it's at breaking point, and we're seeing it in every single league, every sport. So just because it worked for Formula One doesn't mean it works for football. If we get to the World Cup final, I don't know, you'll probably know better exactly when the World Cup final in
July the 7th or 8th.
Yeah.
No one knows because it's such a long tournament now.
And Donna wouldn't buy a ticket.
Exactly. No. Can you imagine how many games Declan Rice or whoever would have played, and then he's meant to be in his absolute peak at the biggest game of his life. But then also from our side as viewers, scarcity sometimes really drives desire and wanting to watch it. When we grew up, the opportunity to watch Maradona play, you'd heard about this guy. Whereas now we see him all the time. And I appreciate things have changed with digital media and social media, so on and so on. But I do think there are different approaches as opposed to more of the same product.
Gentlemen, that's a really nice way to end our first podcast. I think anyone watching and listening will know we do things differently here. It's informed, it's experience-led, it's data-led, it's research-led. Thank you for your company. Okay, that's it for the very first edition of the Sports Structured Podcast with Leonard Curtis. It's not just opinions we're gathering, but data, information and analysis, all with the aim of diving a bit deeper into how major sports function financially, where they're at now and where they should be going.